Apologies, the technology failed me. There's a rather clumsy termination to the previous video, but I won't re-record it because I think essentially until the QuickTime video software gave out, it was doing okay. Well, that's my opinion, of course, but hopefully you'll find it tolerable. So let me pick up where I left off, and we were talking about the fact that the intradiegetic events might not themselves be textual in terms of a letter, perhaps, or a piece of other textual content. They may not be spoken, as in the case of a witness report. They could be visual evocations, for instance, of a dream or of perhaps a portrait, some kind of pictorial reference. Berg does this, for instance, in his opera Lulu. The central character Lulu is evoked even when she's not on stage by a painting we see prepared of her at the very beginning of the opera. Metadiegetic embedding, so we're moving on a little now in the text, and the insertion of multiple layers of narration within a tale that's already underway. Why does this happen? It's there, says Genette, to create a kind of causal continuity, that is, a thematic correlation, but also a sense of syntactic connection as the narrative unfolds. So let's just play with this idea. I'm going to start asking some questions now. In fact, there'll be 9 questions overall, so I'll increase the number of questions. Hopefully that won't be too burdensome to everyone. So the idea of causal explanation or thematic correlation. Question 1. Which 19th century symphony exploits this technique? By recalling its 3 previous movements at the beginning of the finale. It does it through an instrumental recitative, interestingly enough. But when the instrumental recitative comes to an end, it is almost sort of terminated by the entry of a voice. So what famous words does the voice introduce, and which piece and which composer am I thinking of? So 19th century symphony, which exploits this metadiegetic concept, recalls its 3 previous movements at the beginning of the finale, does this in the context of an instrumental recitative, and then the recitative is pushed aside, and suddenly a voice enters and utters very famous sung words to terminate what the instruments have been doing up to that point, what the orchestral ensemble has done up to that point. Question 2. Which 19th century orchestral composition exemplifies the use of metadiegesis for the purposes of distraction and obstruction? So which 19th century orchestral composition, this is by a Russian composer, exemplifies the use of metadiegesis for the purposes of distraction and obstruction? In fact, we find that Genette refers specifically to this particular narrative instance, but it was turned into a well-known orchestral composition by a Russian composer. What is the piece? Question 3. Which United States political tactic exploits this function as a performative act? Again, Genette refers specifically to this. The idea of metadiegesis, embedded narrative. There is a particular instance in the context of a United States government that involves this particular technique as a performative act, where a speaker speaks at great length on the floor of the House or the Senate. Why is that happening? What is it called? So give me the name of what it's called. Question 4. What Greek word does Genette employ to describe the narrator's capacity to effect a transition from one level to another? So we are moving now between levels, but to indicate that this is underway, Genette says we could utilize a Greek word. What is the Greek word that he employed? It begins with M, so there's a clue. So 2 more questions. Question 5. The power of narrator in this regard can arguably appear to erode narrative boundaries and imply that readers themselves are effects of the writing process. It's a kind of short-circuiting of the relationship between the teller and the told. So here's my music-related question for you. The idea then of eroding narrative boundaries. Which United States composer, which American composer pioneered this same effect musically beginning in the 1950s? So which American composer eroded the relationship between composer, performer, and listener very deliberately throughout the 1950s and forwards? Question 6. Which piece by this composer most famously exploited what Genette speaks about next? He says that the lack of a kind of typographical convention to indicate the shift between narrative levels means that often this is done to almost confuse, deliberately seduce us into being unsure which narrative level we're actually resting on at a particular point. But this same composer also noted this typographical convention, and he did it by using temporal duration itself as a title. So what was the piece? Beginning of the 1950s, there was a piece that exploits the use of typographical convention and shows how important, how essential that is. Which piece are we talking about that uses the length of the piece as a title by the composer referred to in question 5? So I'm going to stop this video. In fact, what I'll do is make a series of 3 videos. So I'll pause again here, otherwise it might just get a bit too long for me to be able to comfortably upload it to YouTube. So whereas I started thinking it would be 2 videos, I'll tell you what, let's make 3. So this is the second video. And I'll now continue to the end in the 3rd and final video, and that should complete the thought about or thinking about Genette that we really need to make sure that we have a mind for. Okay, so I will just stop now and hopefully make a less clumsy edit than the previous video did. All right, bye for now.